Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Paradigm Shifting Books. Today, we're really excited and happy because we have our dad, Stephen M.R. Covey, back on the podcast. Listeners who've listened in the past may remember the great episode we did, actually up in Montana. We recorded that on your book, The Speed of Trust. And as you know, Dad, and obviously with Britt joining the podcast, even though we've already recorded, I recorded with our uncle Sean, your brother Sean, on the 7 Habits. Britt didn't want to not have an opportunity to also review the 7 Habits. I mean, that's one of the inspirations that we both have for this podcast, and obviously our grandfather, Stephen R. Covey, who sometimes we'll refer to as Papa, because that's how we called him. But Stephen R. Covey, who wrote the 7 Habits, has had such a huge influence in my life and Britt's life and inspiration for the podcast. So that's why you're back on, Dad.
I'll take it.
I didn't want to go without doing the 7 Habits. I had to. And yes, for all listeners, I don't think it's something I'm going to be able to curb. Probably going to refer to him as Papa unknowingly. So if you hear that is our grandfather, Stephen R. Covey. And we also have quite a few messages from listeners and questions that we're going to add into the mix. So listen for your question, and we appreciate all questions that have been asked. That's kind of what we're hoping for on this podcast, and to have engagement with the listeners, because again, Britt and I are not experts ourselves on any of this. We're just curious and interested and inspired by all these books, especially this book, 7 Habits. So, Dad, you obviously have kind of a really unique perspective on the 7 Habits, not just because you were the CEO of Covey Leadership Center and had a huge part to play in growing the 7 Habits from a business perspective, but obviously you grew up with Stephen R. Covey as your father, your dad. And you witnessed kind of the development of the 7 Habits over the years. So that's probably the first question I have. Can you describe how Papa initially conceived of the idea of the 7 Habits? What inspired him over the years? What did you witness growing up and on?
First of all, this is so exciting to be with you guys to do this. It's really fun, and especially to be with my sons, you had this chance to do it. And also, just like Britt, you want to make sure you had a chance to weigh in on the 7 Habits. I feel the same. I didn't want Uncle Sean, my brother Sean, to be the only one that gets to talk about the 7 Habits. So the fact that we're doing this is great. And here's what I will say is, initially, the 7 Habits were kind of taught as individual principles, one by one, before my dad, before Papa, Stephen R., before he put them all together as 7 Habits. Initially, I remember as a kid growing up in the home, and one time we had a family meeting and he talked about, kids, we got to begin with the end in mind. And, that later became habit 2, but at the time it was just a standalone principle, begin with the end in mind. And then in other times we'd hear about, you got to seek first to understand, then to be understood. Now later that became habit 5, but at the time it was not taught in sequence and conjunction. It was just a standalone principle, and kind of almost every one of them I can remember at different times being taught that principle. And it was really just over time that Stephen R. began to say, hey, I'm going to put these together into a sequence. It became more clear that there was a real power in a sequence, that individually the principles were powerful, but in sequence, they're even more powerful. And the idea that a private victory precedes a public victory, and that you go from dependence to independence to interdependence, and there's a sequence, and then you renew it all. What became habit 7, sharpen the saw, which was really the idea of renewal of any of all of these. So that's kind of how it started, as individual principles that were being taught. And we kind of learned these in the home. I think that we were us kids, your aunts and uncles, we were the first guinea pigs for 7 Habits as individual principles. taught one by one at different times. And over really, 10, 15 years before it kind of all came together as a model, as a sequence of 7 habits of highly effective people. So that's kind of the most interesting thing. And then also seeing how impactful it was, how universal, how it impacted people everywhere in the world. And the interesting thing about it is Stephen began teaching 7 habits about a decade before the book was published. So he began to teach it as 7 habits, and it was a whole 10 years later before the book came out. So that was really interesting to see the interest and the impact that it had.
It's funny to hear you say that you guys were the guinea pigs, because we all know that Papa used to like to have family meetings and councils. And I even remember being a little 8-year-old and having a family council. And I think I might have mentioned this on our other episode, but me just like wanting to run away and hide because I'd be like, oh, Papa's having another 2-hour council. I'd get my cousins and we'd be like, let's go. Now, if I could go back, I would give anything in the world to be a part of those councils because this is the stuff we would talk about. But I can't imagine with what you guys were. You'd always tell us that Papa used to go pretty long on those, and he lacked a little bit of awareness with the family council.
You had 2-hour councils as grandkids. As kids, we had 3-hour councils. Seriously.
Oh, that is hilarious.
And it's the same thing. I look back now and I say, my goodness, how blessed we were. But at the time, we were like you. We were not different. We were bored stiff. We just wanted it to end.
Yeah, I love it. Well, because you had such an early just opportunity to listen to those, did you notice any significant changes over time? How did the either the idea for the 7 habits or any habits in general evolve over time? Were there any significant changes? Things called by different names that initially started as something, more habits, less habits? What changes did you see over time?
Yeah, well, the names of the habits kind of changed. The principles were always the same, but the names changed. I remember seeing a 7 habits presentation, and there was a 1-page handout on it, and I saw the 7 habits. The first habit was called proactivity. The second habit, begin with the end in mind, was called creativity. And the third habit, put first things first, was called productivity. They were phrased in these one-word expressions, but it was the same principle, that you're productive, because you put first things first, and you're creative because you begin with the end in mind, and so forth. And then think win-win. Habit 4, I remember, was called mutual benefit, which is the principle behind it. And then I think habit 5, seek first to understand, then to be understood, initially was called mutual understanding. And I can't remember what synergy was called. I think it was called creative cooperation. And then habit 7, sharpen the saw, was called initially renewal. But then over time, it was the same principles, but then the decision was made to put these in the form of an expression, of a statement, of an action-oriented thing, a verb, something I can do. Begin with the end in mind. Put first things first. Think win-win. So more action-oriented, not just a noun. But I always remember it being 7, because again, the big idea that came to Papa was the idea of sequence, of these principles, that the real power was in the sequence. And so rather than just teaching them as isolated principles, what if, habits 1, 2, and 3, that's all about helping a person go from dependence to independence, where they can become, a capable, responsible person because they're proactive. They begin with the end in mind. They put first things first. And that kind of is this private victory, that if you can win the private victory with yourself, then you can go out and win public victories with others. And, and then that was the next 3 habits, 4, 5, and 6, which was about working with other people interdependently, going from independence to interdependence. And so that was always the same. And then the renewal habit 7, sharpen the saw, was always the same. So there always was 7, but the names were different. They also used to, Papa's name for 7 habits was initially the 7 basic habits of highly effective people. The word basic was there because he was kind of saying, look, there's other things that people can do in life, but these are foundational. These are basic habits. But the publisher said, that's too long. We got to shorten it to just the 7 habits. And so that was kind of fun. The subtitle changed a lot through the years because initially the subtitle was the 7 habits of highly effective people. And then the subtitle was restoring the character ethic. Then over time, it changed to powerful lessons in personal change, which is more descriptive of what the gain would be for a reader. This is about personal change. And here's great lessons, powerful lessons. But it started as restoring the character ethic. And that really came from what started this all for where Papa put this all together was the idea that he did that 200-year study of the literature in America, where he looked and saw that for the first 150 years, the literature was focused on character. And then the last 50 years, there was a shift from character to what you might call personality, more skills and more techniques and things. And that shift from character to personality, was probably maybe not helpful. And that these 7 basic habits were all about kind of restoring the character ethic, going back to character as the basis, the primary greatness, not just secondary greatness. So those were some of the shifts, but it was always 7. Don't ever remember it being different than that. But the names changed. The sequence was really always the same. But that's what came through as an insight to Stephen, was that sequence matters.
One more question around kind of the genesis of all of this is, you mentioned your family, so your brothers and sisters kind of being guinea pigs. And I think Britt and I can relate to that in some sense. If anyone listens to the Speed of Trust episode, Dad used me as kind of a guinea pig on some trust issues I had as a teenager. So outside of family, I've always wondered what else contributed to him being able to come up with these insights. I mean, he was a university professor, which obviously is the big one. And then didn't he do a lot of work, before leaving as a professor? He did a lot of work with large corporations for years, right? Like this was like a 20, 30-year process of coming to this, is my understanding, right? I mean, I've always wondered, like, how was he able to synthesize all of this the way he did?
It's interesting because Stephen used to always say that it takes 10 years to write a book. And in the case of 7 Habits, I think it was 20 years. I think he literally worked on this for years, but it began the way you described, son. It was he would go out and begin to teach companies. And again, he would teach individual principles. He would teach, what became habit 5. Seek first to understand, then to be understood. And then separately, he would teach, begin with the end in mind. Or separately, he would teach, put first things first. And it was just over time as he was doing this, and he was doing leadership development, training, speaking, consulting, and began to work more and more with companies. And it became more and more clear that these principles were valuable, but if he could organize them, make them accessible, tangible, actionable, that was really valuable. And that's where the sequence ideas came to him. Private victories precede public victories. Go from dependence to independence, interdependence, and then renew it all. And then that's when he started teaching that idea. And then pretty soon 7 Habits was born as 7 Habits. But again, he went another decade teaching 7 Habits to businesses, to organizations all around the world. before kind of the book came out. So it really was a 20-year journey probably. And even before that, because it was really his whole lifetime that kind of all the influences, and it was his own experience, but also it was the experience of working with clients and getting feedback and hearing from others and seeing how it worked. And maybe when it didn't work and what was valuable and what people globbed onto. And so it really was a couple of decade process of producing what became the 7 Habits.
And that feedback that you're talking about, that feedback loop, what was that like in that process of publishing it? What was the perception of it? What was the?
Well, the feedback was really good because it was come directly from clients. Because again, Dad was doing the client work just out there working with companies, and people would respond and say, this really works. And we're connected to it. And so I knew when the book was coming out that it was going to be well received because the clients were responding so well to the training and to the speaking. So I knew the book was going to be well received. But it was interesting, though, the very act of publishing, the publishers don't know that he's doing this training and stuff. And I think we have a total of like 27 rejection letters from publishers.
Wow.
Where the agent was Dupree Miller, Jen Miller, and she went out and went to all these publishers saying, we're going to write a book called The 7 Basic Habits of Highly Effective People. And I've seen a lot of these, and some of them say, well, we think this is a nice idea, but we don't think it's big enough to sell very many copies, so we're going to pass on. And things like this, and where some people would say, nice idea, but not big enough, or nice idea, but it's been told before, or this or that. And so 27, I think there was 27 rejection letters.
Wow.
But then Simon & Schuster caught the vision that this could be big. But I knew it was going to be big because I was with your grandfather when he would be presenting it with clients. I saw how people responded to it. I just saw how personal it was to people, how practical it was, and that this could really work. And so I knew it was going to take off, and it did. It was not an instant success, but it kind of was like a build, and make it like a rocket ship that just was taking off and going higher and higher. And then pretty soon it just went into orbit.
Wow. You mentioned you were able to be with Papa quite a bit as he's teaching people the 7 Habits over the years. So maybe a more personal question, but, do you have a memory, an experience of how your father influenced your own understanding of the 7 Habits of living an effective life? Does anything, stand out to you?
A whole bunch of experiences. One was even when I decided to join a company, and I was coming out of business school. I'd had a couple of years work experience prior. I had an opportunity, on Wall Street, pretty exciting. I had an opportunity in real estate development that was pretty exciting. I'd worked with them before. And those were the reputable offers, and then I had a chance to join with my dad, your grandfather. And that was just a small company, fledgling, no one had heard of it. And this was my business school. All my classmates are going to Wall Street, or they're going to investment banking or to consulting firms or manufacturing companies and stuff. And then I end up joining this, it's hard to call it a family business because it wasn't. It was just a small fledgling firm. But this was before the 7 Habits had been published. And I knew this book was going to take off. I just knew it because I'd seen it. But the principle on this was the idea of purpose and impact. Because I remember just trying to decide what to do. And I was leaning towards maybe doing the real estate and the real estate development. And I remember Papa coming to me and saying, that's great if you want to do that. My question to you is, do you want to build buildings or do you want to build people? And it was a way of me of saying, you know what? I really do want to build people. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with building buildings. That's a useful thing. It's valuable. We need buildings, and that's important too. So that's an important purpose. It just wasn't my purpose. So I started to, it was a way of learning, kind of begin with the end in mind for me. What matters to me? What are my, what are my values? What's my end in mind? And again, I'm not going to judge anyone else's because they, building buildings might have been perfect for their end in mind. But for me, I was more drawn towards an impact on people. And partly because I grew up with Dad and I saw this and I saw his influence, and it was kind of in my DNA, I felt. And so, but that was kind of a way of me discovering what is my end in mind. And have I thought about my end in mind? What matters most to me? And it was really the principle that we've heard him teach all of us, that life is about contribution, not accumulation. And it's about creating value and having impact and making a difference. And so that was my way of kind of learning habit 2 for me, beginning with the end in mind for me. What's my end in mind? What are my values? What are the things that are most important to me? And I kind of learned it through the process of deciding to join the company.
That's honestly, whenever somebody asks me what my favorite quote is, I always say that one.
Yeah,
I say life is not about accumulation, it's about contribution. Because I think it's so easy to get wrapped up in that. All of us do. I do it. I almost have to fight that on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And I think initially, when you hear that quote, you kind of think of it as a little bit unrealistic. Like, okay, but can I really live a life where I'm content with the purpose being contribution more than accumulation? Because everything geared towards us today is to try and accumulate.
Right.
Accumulate wealth, accumulate accolades, whatever it is. And really, as I fight that and I have my purpose be more based on contribution, I am so much happier. And accumulation comes as a byproduct, obviously. But that is one of my favorite quotes and principles from Papa that I think is so powerful in the 7 Habits.
I think it is. And he later kind of expressed it another way, a couple of other ways. One he would call primary greatness versus secondary greatness.
Yeah, expound on that, because I think that's such a great principle.
Well, that's literally, it's weird you mentioned that, Dad, because that's literally like where my mind went, just barely. Because a lot of listeners that have, typed in questions, which we appreciate. A theme of some of the questions was around how can I be successful? What is success? And I feel like if you get on the internet today and I've done it, go to YouTube and you say inspirational, successful videos or something. And then there's all these different videos and it's like they're all different things. And most of it feels around like accumulation, not contribution. I'm not saying all of them. There's great stuff out there. But I feel personally that the concept of primary and secondary greatness is great. So I just wanted to mention that I felt like that's, with you going that way, I think it's relevant to the questions people asked about this episode and where my thoughts were too.
I think it's an important point, what you're just mentioning, that look, there's different ways we can kind of say what success looks like and what it is. And there's a secondary greatness, which is things like achievements and accomplishments and accumulation and titles and accolades and things. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. It can be a good thing, and we want that. We want to achieve. We want to accomplish things and such. And so it's a greatness. It's secondary only because what a primary greatness is the development of character, of integrity, of respect, of empathy, of compassion. You develop yourself, you develop your character, your desire to contribute, to add value, to make a difference, to have purpose and meaning and contribution in life. And so a focus first on primary greatness of developing your character and your competence and your integrity and your maturity, your courage, your consideration, your empathy, that by having a mindset that says that matters, becoming and being, as opposed to just seeming or pretending. If you put that kind of first, then you'll also have some secondary greatness that will follow naturally. You can achieve and will achieve. And so it's not like it's good and bad or either or, but it's just kind of a prioritization of primary greatness, focusing on really becoming and being and not just achieving and accumulating. And so it's just a kind of a mindset, a framing of it. Stephen was pretty realistic about this too, because there is a Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You move from survival, that's where you're on the low end of the Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You're trying to survive, to stability. Now you've improved. You're more stable. To success. Now you're achieving. To significance. And now you're kind of contributing and giving back. But there is kind of a hierarchy and kind of a flow. And it's hard to just say, I'm going to go to significance when you're trying to survive. And be stable and trying to build a foundation. So there is kind of a hierarchy, and there is kind of a process of getting there. That's why, hey, a lot of us are in the survival. We're trying to survive. We're trying to get stable, and we're trying to achieve success. But if you just all along have a mindset of saying, this is good, and my mindset is I want to ultimately move towards significance, towards contribution. And I'm on the journey. I'm not fully there yet, but my mindset is to get there. Then that gives a framing for all of this. And so it's not seen as, well, accumulating is bad. No, it's just part of being on the journey. But along the journey, we can still have a mindset of contribution and of significance, of mattering, of trying to make a difference. And rather than waiting until the very end saying, hey, I'll contribute after I've accumulated, we say, no, we try to contribute along the way. We don't just wait to the end. So that's another way of thinking about it.
Britt, I want to ask you this whole concept of primary, secondary greatness. For you, being in the NFL, this has had to have been kind of it's almost like a warped perception of life in some ways, where you are in the top percentage of players in the world in a sport. There's obviously a lot of money, a lot of accumulation, a lot of, people wanting to appear certain ways. I mean, I don't know the exact question I want to ask you around that, but I know it's been just an interesting thing for you to grapple with the last couple of years. I mean, how has the 7 habits, how has this concept helped you? And I know you're not perfect at it necessarily, but what's your experience been with that? Because I think it's a unique experience. There's a very small percentage of people that have that.
Really true.
Yeah. I think that, and maybe it's the tale as old as time kind of adage of when you look around at these guys who are making millions of dollars or so successful, top percent in the world, some of them literally top 1 or 2 in the world at what they do. And you see through personal conversations with them that at times it's just an endless pursuit, an endless chase of things that don't bring that peace, that happiness, that security in their lives. And it's really fascinating to talk with people who, the quote, money can't buy happiness, right? Who people think, oh, money can buy happiness. Well, no, I've been around people who have enough money to quote unquote buy happiness, but they, there are times when they just don't have it, and they look for these outside sources. And that's why a lot of them get into reading. That I've had many teammates ask me about the 7 habits, and I've given the book to many of them. Many people talk about this idea without knowing what to call it, primary and secondary greatness. But I think it's just that idea of that the peace in your life doesn't come from accumulation. And so you should still try for that accumulation because it's important and it does bring happiness. But I think that stability and that peace, you need to couple it with that primary greatness. And So I definitely have seen that. People assume all the time that because I'm in the NFL, I must be happy and have achieved my dreams. And there's still, I feel like with everybody, there's still like this almost emptiness that you feel that you only feel as you strive for primary greatness. So I think the power comes in the coupling of the two. Because yeah, even in the NFL, right? You talk with guys who they still just crave that idea of primary greatness and loving who they are as a person and really respecting themselves and looking in the mirror and being proud of what they're doing and the person they're becoming. And I think that's what the power of the 7 habits is in, right? Is it gives people back their lives. I've heard you say that, Dad. And
Yeah.
I think maybe just allude to that a little bit, just the power of the 7 habits that you've seen.
It's powerful because, like you're saying, if I can have that private victory, in other words, that I feel like, gosh, I'm true to myself and I know who I am and I'm trying to live my best way that way. If I could start there, there's a power that comes from that. And that gives me the power now to work well with others because I'm secure and I can be more abundant towards others. It's hard to be abundant with others if you don't feel secure yourself. So it's hard to think win-win with others if you're just fighting for your win and you don't feel like you've got that sense of peace and security. So that's why the first 3 habits, moving from dependence to independence, that private victory, that's why it's so powerful because it gives people a sense of security and of that I'm working on myself and my character. I've tried to lay out my values and I'm trying my best to live to them. And when you do your best at that, there's a sense of peace that comes and a sense of power that comes from that integrity, that being true to who you are and who you want to be. And again, none of us are there. That's why you're always on the journey. And then now that helps me do the same thing now with other people, where I can work well with others and go from independence to interdependence and think win-win because I feel secure. So now I can try to help do something better with another person. And I seek first to understand, then to be understood, habit 5. And then I synergize. We try to create something bigger, better, where synergy is where 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 10, something that we create that's better than either one of us could do on our own. And that's the power of that public victory. And there's a power that comes from that we're better together. And then you renew it all with this habit 7, sharpen the saw, the idea of renewal. And there's power to that. So I think there's power in the private victory, there's power in the public victory, and there's power in renewing it. And that's the strength of the 7 habits is it takes any of us where we're at and gives us something we can immediately work on and get better at and gain a sense of clarity, of integrity, and of power, of peace, of security that comes from this. And so the 7 habits is a great way to operationalize this idea of primary greatness.
I think that all listeners are struggling with something, and just to start off the habit of be proactive. And that sounds so generic, but when you read it, anyone who starts reading that, I think, feels this empowerment come over them of, okay, I know I'm stressed at my work about this particular thing, but that is outside of my control. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I've learned, and in the NFL, is there's so much outside of your control. I mean, I'm competing with guys who are bigger than me. Everyone's bigger. I'm competing with guys who are bigger than me, faster than me, stronger than me, everything. But this idea of being proactive is focusing on only what you can control, what's on your circle of influence, and you learn to be okay with the things outside of that. And that brings that power to you is like, I'm not a victim to whatever's happened to me, to the situation around me at work or in my job. At least my mental state doesn't have to be, because I have a few, even if it's only a few things I can control, I'm going to master these. I'm going to dominate them. And you are okay with the results, because things outside of your control, they don't affect you nearly as much. Even if it directly affects you, it doesn't affect you internally. So you feel that power regardless of what's going on outside of you.
I agree with this, Britt, that habit one, be proactive, and recognizing that between stimulus and response, there is a space. We can choose our response. We can choose to focus on our values and not just respond to the circumstances. And we work in our circle of influence and not our circle of concern that we can't impact. That's empowering because it suddenly makes it easier to deal with life's injustices and all the things that we can't do anything about, from the weather to the economy to the fact that there might be people that are better than us or faster than us, stronger than us. Okay, but what can I do in my circle of influence and to grow that circle of influence? Because when you focus there, that circle of influence grows. But when you focus on the external circle of concern, all the things that are out there, that our circle of influence actually shrinks. And we don't feel that same sense of power that comes. So just so useful. That simple idea, be proactive.
I feel like each of the habits, depending on the season in your life, can all of a sudden make a huge impact on you. Obviously, habit one, be proactive, is one that's universal for everyone. But for me, throughout my life, and especially as I've studied the 7 habits more seriously over the last decade, it seems like each of the habits can kind of grab a hold of you at different times in your life, depending on your situation, and there's so much power in them. So that's actually one of the listener questions, Dad, that came in. Actually, it was multiple listeners. They had a question for you personally, and one is from, who was it from? Alexa. Yeah, Alexa Cleverly. We actually got this from quite a few people, but Alexa was the main one. Yeah, so she asked, which habit does he think is the hardest to live?
I would say, almost like your answer, Stephen, that at different times, a different one might pop to the top of the list, where suddenly, with what's going on in my life, a different habit will pop up. And it could be this, for example, think win-win. Sounds really easy. It sounds good. And then you're put into an environment, a situation where there's only so much resource that can go around. There's only so much. And it's hard suddenly to think win-win when it looks like I'm in a win-lose environment and situation. I could do the same with putting first things first. That can be really hard. It sounds easy to put first things first, but then life happens and all these proximate things hit you, and second things can easily become right. They're proximate, they're popular, they're right in front of you, and so on. And seek first to understand, then to be understood. It's just human nature to want to be understood first. And right now we're in a world where everyone's fighting for air to be understood. So to say I'm going to try to understand you first when I feel like I'm not even understood, that can be really hard. So, any of them can become the hardest. I still would, for me, it's still habit one. As the foundational habit, be proactive, but it's so easy to become reactive. In my language, where I start blaming, he makes me so mad. Well, wait, does he makes me so mad like I don't have a choice? And it's very easy to become reactive. It's very easy to focus on my circle of concern, not my circle of influence, and to blame. And so for me, I come back to habit one. But at different times in my life, I could have answered with any of the 7 habits.
Actually, this morning before we interviewed, I listened to the back end of the 7 habits. One of the editions where Papa had like 15 common questions people ask him. And someone actually asked him that question, like, what's the hardest habit? And he says, habit 5, hands down, seek first to understand, then to be understood. And it was so funny the way that he said it. He's like, people just want to talk about their feelings and do it. And I just want to be efficient. And, so it was funny to hear that because we all knew him, but it's great too. It's not like he had maybe mastered the 7 habits in the sense of teaching them, but he openly admitted
not in living them. Like it was, even for the author, it was a constant journey for him. It's something you kind of never arrived to, right? Of living the seven
Yeah.
habits perfectly. He struggled.
Yeah,
He struggled with it too.
He did. In fact, I'll share this. One time I was with Dad. He was asked, "Do you live the seven habits?" And he said, "About 80% of the time." And he basically was saying, "Look, I struggle too, but I always course correct." He said, "But I always course correct to get back on track. This is hard. It's very easy to become reactive. It's very easy to not listen. It's hard to listen when you feel like you're right already. You come in thinking I'm right, and then you might just go through the motions of listening. Because again, the paradigm shift is you don't listen to reply, you listen to understand. And there's a difference between understanding and just replying. And that's hard. And it's very easy to just kind of, yeah. Wait your turn, be patient, listen that way, but not really to understand. That is a hard one. So I can see why he would say that. And he always felt like habit 5 was the most significant kind of breakthrough in human interaction. Seek first to understand, then to be understood, because human nature is so much the opposite. I also would say this, that someone asks, well, what's the most difficult habit? I would just say, what's the one that you're struggling with the most? To someone. And, maybe make that the number one habit for you right now. And that might change over time for any of us.
I love it. I'm going to, because we have quite a few questions, we can do some quick responses to these if we want, kind of out of order and things. Nolan Faley from California asks, if you had to pick an 8th habit previously unmentioned, what would it be?
We got an answer to this because Stephen ended up publishing a book called The 8th Habit. And it wasn't that he forgot one, because the 7 habits is quite complete and whole, the way it's sequenced and structured. But the 8th habit is like another dimension to it. So it's less that I forgot a habit. Here's a new one that's the same as the other 7, just another one that was forgotten, but more a new dimension that adds dimension to all other 7 habits. And it was the 8th habit: find your voice and inspire others to find theirs. And so it's like another dimension in the sense that it's another manifestation of the private victory leading to a public victory. The private victory, which is you find your voice, who you are, what you're about, the primary greatness, and your contribution, your uniqueness. Find your voice. And then once you find it, now work with others, inspire others to find theirs. So it's like lighting a candle. That candle, once lit, can light a lot of other candles. You can help others find their voice too. Then you have a ripple effect on people. So it's really kind of just adding a dimension of saying it's an upward spiral of living these 7 habits and then helping others live them. And you apply it to yourself, you apply it in your relationships, and it becomes this ongoing, virtuous upward spiral of integrity and power, and then impact on others. Find your voice, inspire others to find theirs. So that's the 8th habit.
Another question that came in from Ryan in North Carolina, and I actually know Ryan. He's a good friend of mine, really insightful person. This was his question. He said, as the 7 Habit book ages and the world changes faster than ever, do you think the application of these habits has changed over the years?
Yeah, great question, Ryan. Yes and no. Yes, in this sense, it's maybe more relevant today than ever before because, I just use habit 5. Right now in our society, no one feels understood. No one's listening. Or if they're listening, they're not listening with the intent to understand. They're just listening with intent to reply. Look at our politics. Look at the conflict that's going on, and people don't feel understood. So has there ever been a more important time to apply, to live habit 5 of seeking first to understand? That's a gift. That's like giving someone air. What oxygen is to the body, understanding is to the heart. to the soul, to the person. And when someone doesn't feel understood, they're fighting for air, if you will, psychological air, emotional air. And to understand another person is like giving them a gift of air, they feel heard. You may not agree. Understanding does not mean agreement. It just means you're trying to understand. And that is so important today. Habit one is so important today when there's, so much outside of our circle of influence. And again, it's always mattered, but maybe more so today. But also habit one speaks of the unique human gifts and endowments of independent will and self-awareness and creative imagination and conscience. And in an age of artificial intelligence, this is genuine human intelligence, wisdom, and unique human gifts, conscience, and the like, and self-awareness that is so important in a time like today. And I could go on and on with each of the 7 habits. So it's a great question, but I find that because the 7 habits are based upon principles, and principles are timeless and changeless. Now, the application of those principles will change. The practices will change. But right now, there's so much change going on, it puts a premium on what's changeless. And people want an anchor during a time of change. And so that's why, your primary greatness of who you are, your character, that's really important as you're navigating all these changes that are impacting and whipsawing us to focus on what's changeless. And the 7 habits are changeless principles from the inside out. And so maybe because there's so much change, it's even more important to have that which is changeless principles. 7 habits, or each habit is based upon a principle that's changeless. Now, the applications might adapt and respond, but we want that changeless core more than ever before.
We had a couple questions that I think you just answered, Dr. Moore from New Jersey. Hopefully that answers your question kind of about the same idea. Now, I think it'd be good to really quick reference just that, we've named this podcast Paradigm Shifting Books. And that is a phrase that comes from our grandfather, paradigms, right? He talks so much about paradigms. And that's, I think, part of the beginning of 7 habits. So if you could explain kind of what he meant by paradigms, why they're so central to the 7 habits, and how you'd recommend people control their paradigms, shift their paradigms, just the whole concept.
Stephen didn't invent the word. It's a scientific word, right? That started with Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and how you have a paradigm shift, and it's really true in science where, you have understand something and then you get new data and it shifts the whole paradigm, the way of thinking about it. So paradigm comes from the Greek paradigma. It means a mental map or model. And this was always important to Papa, that he would say this. He'd say, we don't see the world as it is, but rather as we are. Our head creates our world. The mindset, the map we have of the world helps us interpret it. And if you have a map, a map is meant to describe the territory. We hardly use maps anymore today because of our phones. We just plug it in and GPS takes us there. But, think of a map that's trying to describe the territory. So I might have a map of a city that lays it out. But what if you had an inaccurate map of that city? It was inaccurate. You're trying to follow the map, not using your GPS, just following a map. But it was inaccurate. Or even what was in the GPS was inaccurate. It was not an accurate map of the territory. That would lead you, you wouldn't find your destination. You would get frustrated and so you got to have an accurate map of the territory. So this idea of a paradigm of how we view the world was so important because it guides and predicts and it explains. That's the power of a paradigm. And it's also the fastest way to have greater impact and to change your behavior. Dad used to always say this, that if you want to make small changes, change your behavior. But if you want to make big changes, change your paradigm, how you see the world. Get an accurate map, a more complete map, or a more whole map of the world, of people, of leadership. And that's the idea. So paradigm shifting book. I love the name of your podcast, sons, because it's saying, look, if we can have a paradigm shift, get a more complete, more accurate map of people, of leadership, of life, then that will interpret everything differently. It comes from that. And in a sense, each of the 7 habits is a little bit of a paradigm shift from traditional thinking. I'll just give it as an example of, habit 1, be proactive. An incomplete, inaccurate paradigm is that I am a product of my circumstances. A more complete, more whole, accurate map is, no, I'm a product of my choices. I'm influenced by my circumstances and heavily influenced, but ultimately I'm a product of my choices. I can choose my response and so forth. And so that's the idea of a paradigm. It's how we view the world. And when you have a paradigm of something, then you interpret things differently. You filter out evidence that doesn't fit your paradigm, and you magnify the evidence that does. And so you literally read things into it based upon that paradigm. So always start with the paradigm. That's why he starts the book with looking at something, and someone sees, a young lady, and someone sees this old lady on this little map of viewing things, and they're both right, but it's your conditioning, how you view the world. It influences how you interpret the world. So we often never check our assumptions, our paradigms. And that's the idea. Start with that. So powerful when you do.
You articulated perfectly. The reason why we called this paradigm shifting books is that's what I've always been struck with Papa's work is he'll always start everything off talking about paradigms and the way you see the problem is the problem. And I think so many other people are focused on what's the quote? It's for every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, only one is hacking at the root, or what's the exact quote?
Yeah, is by Thoreau. For every 1,000 hacking at the leaves, there is only one hacking at the roots.
The roots, yeah. And
there's only one striking at the roots. So we're trying to go to the roots. Go to the roots. Stephen used to always say that, 7 habits, the key thing we're trying to teach here is paradigms and principles. They have a more complete, more accurate paradigm. I've learned about paradigms that they're generally less that it's right and wrong, good and bad paradigms, but more or less complete. Some paradigms are just less complete. Like, how do you view people? Do you view them just as economic beings, just a body? Well, that's not inaccurate, because people do have a body and they do care. They want to get paid. They are economic beings, but they're whole people. They also have a heart. So they want to care and to love and to belong. They have a mind. So they want to grow and to develop. They have a spirit. They want to contribute and add value and make a difference, have significance. So it's more complete to view someone as a whole person and not just an economic being. So an incomplete paradigm is, hey, people are just, all they care about is money. A more complete paradigm is they're a whole person. They do care about money, but they also care about relationships and about growing and about contribution. That's more complete.
What I've always found fascinating with Papa's work on paradigms is how quickly a paradigm shift changes just everything, your behaviors, right? What's the quote where he says something will change your behavior faster than focusing on change of behavior will change your behavior? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, that a change in paradigm will change your behavior a lot faster than a focus on behavior. And just trying to change behavior. Change your paradigm.
change your paradigm, which will then in turn change your behavior faster than just trying to white knuckle it, saying, I'm going to wake up at 7 a.m. and I'm going to do this. A quick example that I use is I hated weightlifting always. There's nothing worse, right? I'd rather go out in the field, run some routes, but I was always so small and I hated weightlifting. And I hated when the coaches would pick a general weight for the receiver group. And here I am in the same group as some of these guys who can lift twice as much as me. So I hated lifting. And I always dreaded having these lifts. And then one day I just looked at it. Someone told me, they said, the best ability is availability, and you have to lift so that you're available on the field. And so that in literally 2 seconds shifted my paradigm of weightlifting from getting strong so I can bench 225 pounds and block a linebacker to this helps me stay healthy and stay on the field. Literally within 5 seconds, my entire paradigm shifted and my behavior shifted. I wanted to go to lifts. I started adding more lifts to the end of every lift just to focus on these small muscle groups to help me stay healthy and for injury prevention. And it was amazing how that in literally 5 seconds, my whole paradigm shifted my behavior. I got excited to go to lifts. I got excited to lift extra just for the focus of injury prevention. And I think that's a perfect example, just how a shift in paradigm, of how you view a certain situation completely changes your behavior way more than just focusing on your behavior.
Well, and that's for Britt, for you. I know that's like a 10-year paradigm you had because you hated lifting. Hated lifting.
High school,
Oh my
college.
God. Yeah, but that's a really, I haven't heard you talk about that before. That's a really good example of a paradigm shift will immediately switch or change your attitude and behavior. And sometimes it can be instant, right? And other times it's more of a process. So yeah, Dad, is there anything around paradigm shifting? Like, say someone's listening and they're like, I'd like to shift my paradigm around something in their life, around the way that they see themselves or see others. Is there anything practical around shifting your paradigm? Because it seems like in that moment, Britt had like almost like an aha moment, revelation, instant. And I think there's probably times in our lives when that happens, but probably more often than not, it's maybe incremental. And maybe I'm wrong, but I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think sometimes it can be instant. And Britt, yours in a sense was a 10-year paradigm shift, but then it was instant. How it happened when suddenly you heard this, that'll make myself available. And suddenly you're viewing lifting differently. I love it. It's a great example. I would say this, so if the fastest way to change your behavior is to change your paradigm, the question is, what's the fastest way to change your paradigm? Well, here's a way of thinking about it. Here's a practical tip is change your name, change your roles. So see yourself differently, see the role differently. So for example, when, Britt, you got your young son, and think of how your world changed overnight when Nelson was born. Overnight, you went from just a husband to now suddenly you're also a father. And you got a new name. I'm a dad. And a new role. I'm a parent. And suddenly that impacts how you view everything with that child. Because you got a new name, you're a dad, you're a parent. And a new role, new responsibility. And so I've learned, like with leadership, rather than see yourself as the boss, see yourself as a steward. Have a stewardship for those that I'm leading to serve them. And suddenly it's less about me and more about them. New name, I'm not the boss, I'm a steward. And new role, I'm a leader. And so you change your name, change your role. Papa used to all the time talk about like Man of La Mancha, Don Quixote, and how he would give a new name to Alfonso, the woman of the street. And that Don Quixote came in and said, you're Dulcinea, this extraordinary person. And it's a new name he gave her. And she began to see herself differently. She had a paradigm shift about who she was as a person. I look at the eighth habit. That's a way of saying, find your voice and inspire others to find theirs. So that you find your voice, suddenly you have a new name and a new role for myself, for my life. I found my voice. I found my contribution, found this difference I want to make. So sometimes that's going to be a very practical ways. Other times it happens just, in a variety of different things. I had my own where I got bogged down with all these people asking for what I called, quote, favors, asking for help, asking for endorsement, asking for all these different things. I just get bombarded with all these favors, but I was looking at it transactionally. And then I had a paradigm shift of, here's a chance to serve. Life is about service. Put service above self-interest. And I suddenly went from, I'm doing favors transactionally for people to, I'm serving. These are acts of service. It's not transactional. I expect nothing in return. Learned this from Steve Young, the quarterback. Calls it the law of love, where, you see people as he believes God sees them, and you're expecting nothing in return. And you're seeking another's healing. And I began to see, suddenly I didn't view it as favors, but rather I'm trying to help another, seek another's healing, and I expecting nothing in return. It's a paradigm shift that once I heard this from Steve, that totally impacted me. So they can happen instantly. Dad tells the one on the subway where he has this instant paradigm shift where he sees these kids misbehaving and bothering everyone on the subway. And then the dad is there doing nothing about it. And Stephen was so bothered by this. So he finally goes up and says, hey, control your kids. Can't you see them? They're out of control. And the man said, well, oh yeah, you're right. I'm so sorry. We're just coming from the hospital where their mother, my wife, just passed away. And I guess they don't know how to deal with that. Neither do I, frankly. Suddenly, instant paradigm shift. And suddenly his behavior changed. My dad's behavior changed to, how can I help? Versus judging the person. So they can be instant like yours was, Britt. They can, like what I had when I heard Steve Young describe how to view people rather than transactionally, but transformationally. Or they could happen over time as we start to think about things differently and shift paradigms. But that's the power of a paradigm. It changes behavior faster than anything else. And it impacts change faster than anything else. That's why to have, paradigm shifting books. These are books that are big books, big ideas with big paradigms that if we can understand this more complete, more accurate paradigm, that could shift our entire world. So I love it. I love what you're doing. It's exciting. It's fun.
So kind of the application question for this one would be, since the premise of the book 7 Habits is around how to be an effective person, where should one start outside of reading the book itself? Obviously, that's an obvious answer. Like, read the 7 Habits, dive deep into this. It'll truly change your life and your paradigm. But how would you answer that? If someone wants to be a more effective person, I mean, where did it start?
I'm glad that you just say read the book, because I try to read it literally about every year. Every time I read it, I experience it through the lens I'm looking through now, through my challenges, my problems today. And I find this is such a useful construct. Jim Collins, in the foreword that he wrote for 7 Habits, said, this is like what Stephen R. Covey did for human effectiveness, is the equivalent of a Windows, or what Apple did, an operating system that made technology accessible, usable. And because it was a human interface, it just makes it accessible. And these principles have always been there. The 7 Habits makes it accessible. So, read the book, reread the book, and the new 30-year anniversary edition has got Sean, your uncle, my brother. He wrote all these additional insights. So it's the 7 Habits as written, and then he gives some added insights to it. It's really, really useful. So that'd be one. But then I'm going to come back to habit 1, because it's just so practical. And if you do 2 things, first is watch your language and try to use proactive language. I choose to instead of I have to. And avoid he makes me this or he makes me that, or blaming, pointing, but rather just really look at your language of I choose this and I am responsible as not their fault, his fault, her fault, and so forth. I just find that the language is where it creeps in first. If you become aware of the language, it can really be helpful. And then just focus on working within your circle of influence. Doesn't mean we're not aware of our circle of concern. No, we are. We're concerned about it. It's just focusing there doesn't produce outcomes. And when we focus on our circle of concern, our circle of influence actually diminishes. But if we focus on our circle of influence and work at the edge of our circle of influence, so we do the things that we can directly control, but even those that we can kind of partly influence. So that's kind of at the edge. We maybe don't completely control, but we could influence it. So it's a circle of influence, not of just control, but of influence. We can find that growing and expanding. And you're doing it, Britt, with what you have to do. You're doing it, Stephen, with the work that you're doing in your professional life. I try to do it as well. But that is just maybe the most immediately practical application of the 7 habits between what happens to us and, the stimulus and our response. There is a space, and we can choose our response based upon our values, not just our moods or our circumstances. But it takes proactivity. We pause. We choose our response. We focus on our circle of influence and not be reactive with just an immediate circle of concern. It's just so useful, so practical, so empowering. If that's all you did, you'll find it'll give you a little bit of a private victory. And then you can go from that victory to another victory to another victory and get a greater sense of integrity, of clarity, of power that, I am who I say I am, and I can do something about this. And that will really be empowering for your life and be a foundation to continue to ripple out. So that's a great starting point for, I think, all of us. Watch your language. Use proactive language, not reactive language. I choose to, not I have to. And then focus on your circle of influence rather than your circle of concern. And you watch your circle of influence grow and grow and grow. And then as that happens, we have that private victory. And when we have the private victory, we can then have a public victory. It truly is inside out. I think that's the ultimate power of the 7 habits, is that it's inside.
Thank you so much, Dad. Seriously. And thank you to everybody who's listened. We're excited to have you on, Dad, and we hope that this has been good and short enough and effective enough that people stuck with us the whole way.